A system that permits nothing but obedience can hardly be called free. But if everyone obeyed only the commands they personally agreed with, that system might not survive for a single day. A judge cannot reopen the legitimacy of the entire legal order every time a case begins. A soldier cannot wait until an operation is underway before deciding whether a command is justified. A complex society can function only through relatively stable roles and procedures, with people acting, at least for the time being, according to rules already in place. And that is precisely where the problem begins. When someone enters an institution and takes on one of its roles, what exactly do they surrender? Do they give up only part of their freedom to act? Or do they also surrender their right to judge? Suppose a person believes that a rule is deeply flawed, yet continues to carry out that rule as part of their official duty. Outside their role, they openly criticize it. Is that person still free? Or is public criticism merely a form of consolation after obedience? Can someone obey an institution, criticize it in public, and still move toward freedom? I'm Fish. Today, we are discussing Immanuel Kant's 1784 essay, An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? It is a very short text. Many people who have never read the whole essay still know its most famous phrase, "Have the courage to use your own understanding." It later became one of the defining slogans of the Enlightenment. It is usually understood as a call to reject blind faith in authority, to form your own opinions, and to think independently. None of that is entirely wrong. But if Kant merely wanted to tell us to have opinions of our own, this essay would not remain so powerful more than 2 centuries later. Having an opinion of your own is not especially difficult. A person can reject religious authority and immediately submit to a political leader. They can distrust professional institutions while believing every rumor circulated within their own group. Even someone who ridicules the prejudices of an earlier generation may treat their own political position as beyond the need for justification. Such a person may appear highly rebellious. They may hold strong views on every public issue. Kant would not necessarily consider them mature, because enlightenment does not simply require us to disagree with other people. It requires us to take responsibility for judgment itself. At the beginning of the essay, Kant offers his famous definition. Enlightenment is humanity's emergence from self-incurred immaturity. By immaturity, he does not mean youth, ignorance, stupidity, or lack of education. A person is immature, Kant says, when they are unable to use their own understanding without the direction of another. A child may require guidance because their capacities have not yet fully developed. But when an adult already possesses the ability to understand and still depends on someone else to decide what is true, what is right, and what deserves belief, that adult remains immature in Kant's sense. Kant then adds a controversial qualification. This immaturity is sometimes self-incurred. That does not mean that everyone who lives under oppression is responsible for their own lack of freedom. When information is suppressed, speech is severely punished, or a person's basic survival is threatened, the problem has moved far beyond a simple lack of personal courage. Kant is describing a different situation. A person already possesses the ability to think, but avoids using it because judgment carries a cost. Real judgment is uncomfortable. It means facing incomplete information, choosing between conflicting reasons, and accepting that we may be wrong. Dependence on a guardian offers genuine relief. A book can think for me. When questions of conscience arise, I can hand the decision to a religious authority. When it comes to the shape of my life, I can let a physician prescribe it for me. I no longer have to examine the argument for myself. I no longer have to endure the uncertainty that comes with doubt. And if the result turns out to be wrong, I can always say, everyone believed it at the time. The authorities taught us this. The institution required it. Once judgment is handed over, responsibility can be shifted elsewhere. When someone else makes the decision, a bad outcome allows you to shift the blame and much of the burden of the consequences back onto the authority. That is precisely what makes immaturity attractive. Guardians reinforce this dependence. They tell those under their direction that independent movement is dangerous. Without guidance, you will fall. You will make mistakes. You will create disorder. Someone who has never walked independently may indeed stumble on their first attempt, but instead of treating the fall as part of learning, they may interpret it as proof. I was never capable of walking on my own. The relationship of guardianship then becomes self-confirming. Fear prevents people from using a capacity. Lack of use makes that capacity unfamiliar. The unfamiliarity is finally mistaken for natural incapacity. Kant is not only asking why authority wants to control people, he is asking something more unsettling. Why does a person who already possesses reason turn dependence into a stable and comfortable way of life? This also explains why rebellion against authority is not yet enlightenment. Kant does not believe that overthrowing an old regime automatically produces freedom. A political revolution can replace a ruler. It cannot automatically transform a habit of thought. A person may escape one authority and immediately submit to another. An old doctrine disappears. A new doctrine occupies the same position. The face of the guardian changes, while the need for guardianship remains intact. Someone who constantly opposes authority may therefore remain immature. They reject an old answer, but may still be unable to offer reasons of their own. They may simply replace one ready-made conclusion with another. Kant does not measure maturity by how radical a person's opinions appear. He asks different questions. Why do you believe this? Can you explain the reasons? And when those reasons are challenged, are you willing to examine them again? Freedom, in Kant's sense, is already much more demanding than doing whatever one wants. Freedom requires personal judgment, but this immediately creates another problem. If every person must judge for themselves, how can a society maintain a common order? Suppose an officer receives a command and believes the plan is misguided. May they stop the operation halfway through and demand a public debate on whether the command is legitimate? Suppose a citizen opposes the existing tax system. May they simply stop paying taxes until the law has been reformed according to their view? If the answer is always yes, individual judgment appears to receive maximum protection, but coordinated action may collapse. No institution can function if each participant renegotiates every rule at the moment of execution. If the answer is always no, the danger is equally serious. Once inside an institution, people become nothing more than functionaries. Mistaken rules continue to operate through thousands of individuals who say, "I was only doing my job." Freedom and order now appear to collide directly. If everyone possessed an immediate veto over common rules, institutions might lose the ability to act. If institutions demanded nothing but obedience, individuals might return to guardianship. The most important part of what is enlightenment is Kant's answer to this problem. He distinguishes between two uses of reason, the public use of reason and the private use of reason. These terms are easily misunderstood today. We usually call speech public when it takes place before a large audience, and private when it happens at home or among friends. Kant's use of the words is almost the reverse. To understand his distinction, we can focus on one figure from the essay, a clergyman. When a clergyman stands in the pulpit, he is performing an office entrusted to him by the church. He is expected to teach according to doctrines the institution has already recognized. At that moment, he is not acting purely as an independent individual. He is performing a public function within an organized system. Kant calls this the private use of reason. Private does not mean hidden. Hundreds of people may be listening. It is private because the clergyman's reasoning is being exercised within a limited institutional role. His judgment is constrained by a specific office. But the same clergyman may leave the pulpit and write as a scholar. He may address the entire reading public, identify problems in existing doctrine, argue that certain teachings should be reconsidered, and propose reforms to the church itself. He is no longer issuing instructions on behalf of an organization. He is submitting reasons to anyone capable of understanding and challenging them. This is what Kant calls the public use of reason. The distinction between the public and private uses of reason does not depend on where a person speaks or how large the audience is. The key question is the position from which they speak. Are they performing a specific institutional function or speaking as a participant in a universal community of reasoning and submitting their judgment to public examination? As a clergyman, the person fulfills the duties of the present office. As a scholar, the same person may criticize the rules behind that office. Kant gives similar examples involving military officers and taxpayers. An officer must obey a command during an operation, but may later publish criticism of the military system. A citizen must pay taxes under existing law, but may publicly argue that the tax system is unjust. Kant believes that the public use of reason must remain free. Only under that condition can the public gradually achieve enlightenment. The use of reason within a particular office, by contrast, may sometimes be restricted when necessary to keep common affairs running. This produces the most provocative line associated with the essay: "Argue as much as you will, but obey." Taken by itself, the sentence sounds disturbing. It can sound like a sophisticated philosophy of domination. You may discuss and write, but in practice, you must still act according to the rules already in place. Even expressing your dissatisfaction does not change that. If that were all Kant meant, his theory would not offer enlightenment. It would merely provide obedience with a more dignified vocabulary. But Kant's complete position is more demanding. Public argument is not a harmless outlet for frustration. Within his theory, freedom in the public use of reason is the central condition of social maturity. Obedience within a role only allows common affairs to continue for the time being. It cannot become a broader demand. Because you belong to this institution, you have no right to judge whether the institution is legitimate. A system may define what a particular office must currently do. It may not therefore become the final guardian of reason. Kant tries to separate coordination in action from criticism of principles. At the level of action, society continues to operate according to existing rules. At the level of thought, those rules remain exposed to public scrutiny. A person may fulfill the duties of today's institution while helping to transform tomorrow's institution. They do not have to destroy cooperation every time they perform a role, but neither must they treat the existing order as an unquestionable final truth. Kant's design attempts to avoid two extremes. One extreme says that a person is free only when they reject every command they do not personally approve. But if everyone possesses an immediate veto over every common rule, social cooperation becomes impossible. The other extreme says that institutional necessity requires the individual to stop judging. Along that path, every consequence can be transferred to one's office, and no authority ever has to explain itself. Kant searches for a third possibility. A role may constrain part of a person's conduct without swallowing their capacity for public judgment. Society may require people to follow current rules while still acknowledging that those rules remain open to criticism. If Kant's position were compressed into a single statement, it might be this: he does not give every individual the power to stop an institution whenever they choose. He demands that no institution be allowed to declare that discussion of its principles is permanently over. This is also what distinguishes Kantian enlightenment from immediate revolution. If an institution contains nothing but obedience, change can come only from the voluntary awakening of its rulers or from the collapse of the entire order. But if every criticism immediately becomes refusal to perform one's role, society may fall into permanent disorder. Kant hopes to preserve a gradual path of transformation. Common affairs continue. Criticism accumulates. Old rules do not disappear the moment someone objects to them, but they can no longer disguise themselves as natural and unquestionable. More people learn to judge for themselves and submit their reasons to public examination. Eventually, public argument begins to reshape institutions. The genuinely emancipatory force in argue but obey therefore does not lie in the obedience. It depends entirely on one condition. The public use of reason must remain free. Once authority can determine which principles may no longer be discussed, the balance Kant constructed collapses. And about 10 years later, this problem confronted Kant himself. In 1793, Kant published Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason. This was not simply an anti-religious polemic. Kant was trying to examine whether morality could stand on the basis of reason itself, and how religious belief should relate to moral autonomy. But his interpretation crossed the boundaries established by church authority and Prussian religious policy. In October 1794, Kant received a royal order issued in the name of King Frederick William II of Prussia. The order rebuked him for his writings on religion and instructed him to refrain from further public discussion of religious matters in his lectures and publications. Kant responded. He defended his work, but also promised, as the king's faithful subject, that he would no longer publicly discuss natural or revealed religion through either teaching or writing. Kant understood the promise as applying only to that particular king. After the king died in 1797, he considered himself no longer bound by it. In 1798, in The Conflict of the Faculties, he disclosed the confrontation and returned to the relationship between philosophy, theology, political authority, and freedom of thought. The episode almost appears designed as an experiment in Kant's own theory. 10 years earlier, Kant had insisted that the public use of reason must remain free. 10 years later, political power ordered him to stop using reason publicly. The sharpest part of the contradiction is this. The king was not restricting Kant's conduct within some narrow administrative duty. He was not asking Kant to complete a procedural task as a state official. He was prohibiting Kant from speaking as a scholar about religion. According to the distinction in What is Enlightenment, this was precisely the form of reason that should never have been suppressed. Kant certainly held an institutional position as a university professor, but the royal command crossed the boundary of that office and entered his public identity. It demanded that he surrender the very freedom he had previously called the essential path to enlightenment, and Kant obeyed. Did this mean that Kant betrayed his own theory? There is no simple answer. Kant was approaching 70. He was responding to a direct command from a monarchical state, not participating in a harmless academic dispute. Open refusal could have threatened his position, his ability to publish, and perhaps his broader personal security. We should also notice the precise form of his promise. He said that, as the king's faithful subject, he would remain silent. After that particular king died, Kant resumed the discussion. This suggests that he understood the promise as a personal obligation to one sovereign, not as a permanent renunciation of freedom of thought. But these explanations do not remove the theoretical difficulty. Kant allows institutions to restrict the use of reason within a specific role only because public reason remains free. Here, the state directly closed the space of public reason. Could obedience under these conditions still be understood as a temporary arrangement on the path toward enlightenment? If the ruler has the authority to decide which questions may be publicly discussed, then public reason is no longer a stable freedom. It becomes a permission temporarily granted by power. A philosopher may argue today because the king has not yet prohibited it. Tomorrow, the philosopher must remain silent because the king has changed his mind. Kant's two uses of reason can no longer perform their separate functions. The obedience of the private role begins to consume the freedom of the public thinker. Argue but obey loses its balance. It begins to mean argue when power allows it. When power no longer allows it, continue to obey. That cannot produce public enlightenment. Kant's own experience, therefore, exposes a question that his 1784 essay does not fully answer. Who protects the freedom of public reason? Kant places considerable hope in the enlightened ruler. He imagines that rulers may eventually recognize that allowing public thought does not automatically destroy political order. It may instead help the state improve itself gradually. But if public reason depends on the enlightenment of the ruler, it remains fundamentally fragile. One tolerant sovereign may permit discussion. Another may close it with a decree. Enlightenment still depends on the goodwill of the guardian, and that conflicts with Kant's attempt to escape guardianship. The essay's real mission is an institutional arrangement that can protect public reason from the personal will of a sovereign. The problem is not the absence of one more slogan urging people to be courageous. The problem is whether public reason has any institutional protection at all. Public discussion cannot remain a space generously granted by those in power. It must become a boundary that power itself cannot arbitrarily cross. Otherwise, Kant demands that individuals take responsibility for judgment without securing a durable public position from which judgment can be expressed. People may still preserve disagreement in private, but public reason, for Kant, is never merely freedom inside one's own mind. It requires people to submit reasons to others, allow society to test them, and create the possibility that argument may eventually influence institutions. If criticism remains a private complaint, it cannot complete the work of enlightenment. If arguments may be published but can never affect institutional judgment, public discussion can also become decorative. Whether obedience and freedom can coexist, therefore, depends on more than whether an institution allows people to speak. It also depends on whether criticism is protected, can enter public deliberation, and retains a real possibility of changing the rules. Public reason, in Kant's sense, is not simply the expression of a position. It requires people to offer reasons and submit them to a public they cannot control. A person may have ample opportunity to speak and still refuse to answer objections. They may want others to know their position while rejecting any possibility of revising their judgment. This adds to the number of opinions without necessarily advancing enlightenment. Maturity, therefore, involves a double responsibility. Before authority, I must refuse to surrender judgment permanently. Before the public, I must refuse to turn my own judgment into a new authority. I may demand that institutions explain themselves, but I must also be prepared to explain myself. Enlightenment is never simply a matter of believing in yourself. Private conviction can become a new dogma. We can now return to the question with which we began. Can someone obey an institution, criticize it publicly, and still move toward freedom? Kant's answer is yes. Modern people cannot live outside every institution. We need rules, roles, and division of labour. In many situations, we must coordinate our conduct through procedures that have already been established. Refusing all obedience does not automatically produce autonomy. A person may simply mistake an immediate impulse for freedom, but Kant's own experience reveals a strict limit to this answer. Obedience can coexist with freedom only when it does not destroy the public use of reason. An institution may require someone to follow a procedure within a particular office. It cannot therefore claim ownership over the person's entire capacity to judge, nor can it demand obedience while declaring that its own principles are no longer open to public examination. Once criticism can be closed by authority at any moment, obedience is no longer a temporary arrangement needed for cooperation. It becomes guardianship again. But here Kant leaves another boundary, insufficiently explained. If a command is producing direct and irreversible harm, can someone continue to carry it out while reserving their objection for future public debate? Probably not. Public criticism may contribute to long-term reform, but it cannot automatically remove personal responsibility for present action. Some duties simply coordinate common life. Other commands require a person to participate directly in something they have already judged to be wrong. At that point, saying, "I have already expressed my opposition," is not enough to prove that one remains free, because the institution is producing consequences through that person's actions. This is the burden of maturity. A person may accept guidance, fulfill duties, and acknowledge dependence on others' knowledge, but cannot hand every responsibility over to an institution. Is this command legitimate? Does this rule still deserve obedience? Am I maintaining necessary cooperation or using my role to escape judgment? The true legacy of what is enlightenment is a boundary far more demanding than a slogan encouraging rebellion. Freedom does not require us to reject every institution. It requires that institutions never become the final court of judgment. A society may require people to obey rules, but it must also allow those rules to face public criticism. Offices, of course, carry responsibilities. Carrying them out must not swallow the whole person. An existing order may be preserved for the time being, but it cannot declare that it no longer needs to explain itself. Kant believed that if the public use of reason remained free, humanity could gradually emerge from immaturity. His later experience showed that this "if" was far more difficult than he first allowed. Public reason does not exist through individual courage alone. It requires a space that even power cannot close at will. Yet Kant's central insight remains. Maturity does not mean that a person is finally free from every influence. It means they no longer allow any influence to assume permanent responsibility for their judgment. Obedience can be part of cooperation, and criticism can coexist with duty. But once an institution demands that people stop asking questions, public reason survives only by permission of authority, and professional duty becomes a substitute for personal responsibility. Obedience no longer leads toward freedom. Enlightenment may not begin when a person first opposes authority. It may begin at the moment they finally understand this. We can entrust many things to institutions. We cannot entrust them with our final judgment.